Open Menor ZachBabyTV_stories current search is within R. ZachBabyTV_stories remove R ZachBabyTV_stories filter and expand search to all of Reddit log in expand user menu back go to ZachBabyTV_story or ZachBabyTV_stories one day ago back BossGamer365 we tested wormhole travel but lost contact with the crew. The human race breathed a sigh of relief when we finally colonized Mars. Years of overpopulation and resource shortages left our first planet stressed. Mars was seen as a pressure valve, a new planet for us to build up and eventually ruin. But we all knew it wasn't a permanent solution. With the way our population grows, it would only give us a finite amount of time before we were in the same boat as before. We needed more planets that are farther away and host a greater abundance of resources. To achieve this, humanity created a breakthrough. Using artificial gravity, we were able to bend space and create wormholes. This, in theory, would allow us to travel large distances instantaneously, spreading humanity throughout the cosmos. After years of development, the first ever spacecraft with wormhole travel technology was developed. Initial unmanned tests were incredibly promising, and soon the first ever manned wormhole trip was set to begin. The ship, named the Rosen, was set out on a 5-month voyage to travel from Earth to Mars. Once there, the crew of around 40 were set to activate the wormhole generator and travel back to Earth instantaneously. Everyone knew there were risks, but the developers and engineers were confident in their invention. The day came, and I remember staring at the monitor as the news reporter droned on about the historical precedent of the mission. I drank my coffee from its pouch and watched as the countdown began. The camera changed to a split-screen satellite view of space. One half of the screen showed the Rosen sitting in orbit around Mars, and the second half was a view of space around Earth. When the countdown hit 0, the ship suddenly blinked between the two screens. In an instant, soundlessly, the massive ship traveled over 100 million miles, while I heard the news reporter and people around her celebrating the massive achievement. I squinted my eyes at the screen, noticing the small details they didn't. The ship had gone dark. The navigation lights seemed to have turned off as it passed through the wormhole. Furthermore, the engines looked cool, not emitting the normal blue glow that they normally do. The automated door to my pod opened, and my coworker, Desmond, stuck his head in and grimaced. "You're gonna be needed up front," Desmond said. In his thick Irish accent, I groaned and rolled out of the pod. Peering out the windows of the ship, I could see the Rosen sitting off in the distance. The ship sat in the same orbit of Earth as us, just as dark as it appeared on the screen. As I entered the command room of the ship, I could hear a loud rhythmic beeping coming from the communication panel. I could see Peter and Marcus running remote diagnostics and communicating with our command team back on Earth. "Good to see. You're awake," Peter chimed. I yawned and nodded, gesturing to the control panel as it continued to loudly beep. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Marcus said. When the Rosen made the jump, it came out the other side blaring a distress signal. Despite the signal, we can't reach the crew on comms for whatever reason. We called command, and they said the ship wasn't distressed until it reached our side. And then there's the ship going dark, ... Command is wondering if the jump didn't have any unforeseen reaction with nuclear engines, causing the blackout, or some other electrical malfunction. That ship has made how many unmanned jumps? Desmond interrupted. It came out fine every other time. I'm telling ya, one of those pilots had a royal cock-up and caused this. Yeah, well, that doesn't really matter now, Peter said, taking off his communication headphones and walking away from the comms panel. Command told us to go in through the emergency airlock and provide assistance to the crew on getting the Rosen repaired. The sooner, the better, they said. Fuck me, Desmond said, throwing up his hands. So much for an easy paycheck. The ride over to the Rosen was incredibly short. I remember seeing the massive monolith of the ship towering over our small repair freighter. Despite the crew on board only numbering around 40, the ship itself was designed to support hundreds of passengers as well as their cargo. Our freighter shook violently as we docked into the airlock. Peter typed away on the panel by the large hatch, encrypting his keycard with the needed requirements to access restricted areas on the Rosen. The first set of doors opened, revealing the bright white interior of the airlock. The four of us stepped inside as the hatch behind us closed and the hatch into the Rosen opened. The opening hallway of the Rosen was dark, with the exception of small emergency lights, illuminating the hallways and rooms. You'd think we'd be getting some kind of greeting, Desmond muttered. We are saving their asses after all. Come on, Peter said, clicking on his flashlight and looking at his map monitor on his wrist. We'll find someone and have them explain what's going on. We traveled down the winding hallways of the massive ship, occasionally calling out but receiving no response. The eerie appearance of the empty ship began to settle on us. A palpable tension was building with every echoing footstep down the hall. We rounded a corner to see a human figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was shrouded in the darkness that enveloped the whole ship, forbidding us from getting a good view. Hello, Peter called out. It's good to see another person on here. We were worried for a second. The figure didn't move or speak, leaving us to sit in an awkward silence. You all right, sir? Peter asked as he walked down the hallway. I glanced over at Marcus and Desmond, seeing the confused and worried expression that we were all sharing. As Peter stepped closer, he was suddenly struck still as more of the man's features came into view of the light. He was completely naked and facing away from us. I felt my stomach churn at the sight of him. His entire body was covered in holes of all shapes and sizes. Some of the holes would slightly flex and wave, like the muscles around them were contracting. He looked as though a corpse had been turned into a wasp nest. Inside each hole, I could see a small, white object that was surrounded by a fleshy red meat. As the light cast over his shoulder, the man slowly turned to face us, his face riddled with smaller holes. Holy shit, Desmond whispered as he stepped back. The man's eyes grew wide and wild as he began silently shambling towards us. Peter stretched out his arm and began backing away. Hey, man, he said, you're sick. I'm gonna need you to stand before he could finish. The man lunged forward head first, his arms flailing at his side as if he had no control over them. As he lunged, the holes in the man's head produced deep, red tendrils. At the tips of each tendril were the white objects that I could now see were what looked like hooked porcupine quills. Peter dodged the incoming attack, and the man slammed onto the ground. Marcus reared back to kick him, but Peter stopped him. Don't touch him. Look, Peter yelled, pointing to the holes on the man's sides and back, now protruding those barbs. Before an argument could be had, the man on the floor jumped to his feet and pounced on top of Desmond. We watched in horror as the tendril shot from the man's body and into Desmond's flesh. Desmond screamed and attempted to push the man off of him, but it appeared the tendrils just pulled tighter and tighter. I watched as the tendrils would retract and shoot back out into Desmond's skin, burrowing holes into his body. Peter and Marcus stood back in shock and horror, not knowing what to do to get the man off of Desmond without being struck by the flailing barbs that rose from the man's body. Looking at the man, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. Out of the man's left leg, I noticed a long tendril that extended out of one of the holes and down the hall, rounding the corner. Without thinking, I dropped down to my hands and knees and grabbed hold of the long tendril. It was warm, and I could feel it pulsing in my hand, like a large vein. I tightened both hands around it and began pulling it apart. The vein flexed and stretched like a gummy worm before snapping with a sickening pop. The man on Desmond suddenly flailed back, all of its tendrils retracting back into its body. The thing lurched to its feet. Its arms still drooped at its sides. We prepared for another attack, but the man seemed to just walk aimlessly into the walls of the hallway. as though it was suddenly blind. I was so focused on the man that I didn't even notice Marcus running up behind him. Marcus raised up the large wrench he had retrieved from his tool pack and brought it down on the back of the man's skull. The man fell to the ground, and Marcus hit his head over and over. After a few hits, the man's head was just a pile of mush, but his body was still struggling to get back up. I looked down to see Desmond bleeding profusely from his dozens of wounds. I knelt down beside him, but I knew there wasn't anything I could do. "Oh my God," Peter mumbled under his breath. I looked back to see 6 more people wandering down the hallway, all covered in holes. "We need to get into a locked room now," Peter yelled. "Grab Desmond. Let's go." Marcus and I dropped to Desmond's side, grabbing him by the shoulders and dragging him away from the approaching horde. Peter ran to the nearest room and placed his keycard on the scanner. The scanner dinged, and the door slid open. Don't forget to subscribe and get ready for part 2, coming soon.